Hey guys, I'm Jacob, and today we're going to talk about some of the first Israeli prime ministers. When you think about the founders of the State of Israel, you're probably sitting there imagining a group of passionate, fervent Zionists banding together to overthrow the oppressive yoke of the British, declare independence, and defeat the multitude of Arab armies that attacked the tiny new country. Sure, Israeli politics is messy now, but back then it was one nation with shared goals, ideology, and a common hope for the future, right? Well, no. The truth is that among the Zionist founders, there was always division, infighting, hatred, even bloodshed. So, how did a successful, albeit flawed, modern state emerge from this intense division? Well, let's meet our founding fathers. Two names that dominate the conversation of old-school Israeli politics are former Israeli prime ministers and mortal enemies, David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. Now, they had diametrically opposed views on how to bring about the establishment of a Jewish state, and their bitter rivalry brought the embryonic state to the brink of a civil war. But before we can begin to talk about Begin, we have to look at his predecessor, Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and his disagreements with Ben-Gurion. Both sought the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland and a recreation of a Jewish state, but that's about where their agreements ended. Ben-Gurion was the leader of the Socialist Zionist Party, which dominated the Jewish Agency, a quasi-government of the Jewish community in pre-state Israel. He believed in a gradual settlement of the land and diplomatic cooperation with the British, who controlled the land at the time. And this meant both refraining from officially demanding a state, which they didn't do until the 40s, and agreeing to split Palestine with the Arabs. This approach was mostly shared by his colleague, future Israeli President Chaim Weizmann. But to Jabotinsky, this was a weak and ineffective approach, and in the 20s, he formed his own faction called Revisionist Zionism. Nationalistic and militaristic in nature, Revisionist Zionism's goal was to establish a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River. Now, that may sound insane, but in context, Jabotinsky believed that the Jews had the right to return to their biblical homeland in its entirety, and it should be noted that this geographic area was part of the discussions during the early period of the British Mandate. Jabotinsky believed that only an iron wall, as he called it, of superior Jewish military power could compel the Arabs to accept a Jewish state and basically force them into peace. By the 30s, he wasn't willing to wait any longer for a state, as he believed that European Jewry was headed for a catastrophe and that the Jews needed to get out now. Turned out he couldn't have been more right about that threat, which we now know as the Holocaust. Jabotinsky met with Ben-Gurion 16 times within 2 months in 1934, but they couldn't resolve their differences and remained bitter opponents. Ever the statesman, name-calling wasn't beneath their dignity. Ben-Gurion once famously called Jabotinsky Vladimir Hitler, and Jabotinsky referred to socialist Zionism as the Red Swastika. While Jabotinsky was abroad on a speaking tour, the British revoked his visa and he died in exile in New York in 1940. At a memorial ceremony in Israel, Ben-Gurion gave a eulogy, if you can call it that, where he said, "The great tragedy was that while Jabotinsky clearly saw the end, he failed to see the means for this end, and this failure largely destroyed a great career in Zionism." Note to self, do not let Ben-Gurion speak at my funeral. Anyway, when the state was declared in 1948, Ben-Gurion did not allow Jabotinsky to be reburied in Israel, saying that Israel needed live Jews, not dead ones. Pretty harsh, right? But then again, Ben-Gurion did know how to hold a grudge. A few years after Jabotinsky died, his 30-year-old protege Menachem Begin took the helm of revisionist Zionism and its underground militia, the Irgun. Any animosity Ben-Gurion had for Jabotinsky smoothly transferred over to Begin, whose right-wing, idealistic, religiously inclined, suit-and-tie style didn't really align with Ben-Gurion's left-wing, pragmatic, secularist, shorts and t-shirt way of life. When the British stopped Jewish immigration to Palestine at the start of World War II, the very moment when the Jews needed to escape Europe the most, Ben-Gurion and Begin clashed over how to deal with this dilemma. Ben-Gurion's Haganah cooperated with the British, hoping that after the war, the British would reopen immigration. Begin's Irgun, on the other hand, fought the British, not willing to wait out the war. Begin felt that they needed a safe haven for the Jews fleeing the Nazis now. In fact, Begin threatened that if Ben-Gurion didn't declare independence, then he would. Ben-Gurion feared that Begin's violence was putting the Haganah's relationship with the British and any possible hope for a state in jeopardy. For 3 months, a period infamously known as the hunting season, the Haganah even arrested Irgun members, handing them over to the British, knowing full well that they may be hanged. Despite this, Begin, hoping to prevent a civil war, ordered his men to never fight back against the Haganah. He figured that the Haganah would rejoin the fight once it became apparent that the British were not going to open immigration or establish a Jewish state even after the war. And he was right. Ben-Gurion and Begin briefly joined forces after the end of World War II, but it didn't go so well. In 1946, Begin's Irgun bombed the British headquarters in the King David Hotel with some help from the Haganah. Even though the Irgun called in a warning to the British authorities to prevent civilian casualties prior to the attack, Ben-Gurion still placed the blame squarely on Begin and the Irgun, describing them as the enemy of the Jewish people. The British consider Begin terrorist number one, the most wanted man in Palestine, with a dead or alive bounty on his head. When it was all said and done, it turned out that the Irgun's actions played a major role in the British decision to leave, although this claim was hotly contested by Ben-Gurion, who tried to downplay the Irgun's involvement. And actually, Ben-Gurion and the labor Zionists were pretty successful at taking over the emerging narrative of Israeli independence and painting Begin as a belligerent dissident on the sidelines. When it came to the signing of Israel's Declaration of Independence, Ben-Gurion made sure that Begin was nowhere to be found. Like I said, the dude knew how to hold a grudge. But could things get any worse between them? Of course they could. After the founding of the state, it was clear that there could only be one army. The underground Haganah morphed into the new Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, and Begin agreed that the Irgun would be absorbed into the ranks of the IDF under Ben-Gurion's command. But there was a little snafu. An Irgun ship named the Altalena, carrying 940 Irgun fighters and loaded with thousands of guns and ammunition meant for the new IDF, was scheduled to arrive in Tel Aviv. Begin insisted that the weapons be distributed to former Irgun members of the IDF loyal to him. Ben-Gurion saw this as a threat and feared that Begin was planning a military coup. Now, we won't get into details, for that you can watch our video on the Altalena Affair, but ultimately Begin, who was still on the ship, refused to hand over the weapons, and Ben-Gurion ordered IDF commander and future Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin to open fire on the Altalena. Begin ordered Irgunists not to fire, but in the fog of battle, his orders weren't followed. Ben-Gurion ordered the IDF to sink the ship at sea, and the Irgunists abandoned ship just as the ammunition on board exploded. All told, 16 Irgunists and 3 IDF soldiers were killed in the battle. Irgunists were then rounded up. Still wanting to avoid a civil war at all costs, Begin went on the radio and demanded that his followers not fight the IDF under any circumstances. Some credit Begin with preventing civil war, and Begin himself considered this to be his life's greatest accomplishment. However, to Ben-Gurion, establishing the integrity of one singular army, the IDF, at any cost was the greatest accomplishment of the Altalena Affair. So in the end, everyone was happy, right? Well, not quite. Most consider the Altalena Affair to have been an avoidable tragedy fueled by the strong personalities of 2 of Israel's greatest leaders, both of whom made mistakes. From then on, Ben-Gurion refused to speak with Begin or call him by name in the Knesset and continued referring to his party as fascist. Ben-Gurion's ruling Labor Party systematically delegitimized Begin and his revisionist Cherut party, the forerunner of the Likud, and excluded it from the coalition government for 3 decades until 1977, when Begin was finally elected prime minister on his 9th attempt at the office. Surprisingly, although the animosity between the parties continued, the relationship between the 2 individuals themselves took a turn for the better after Ben-Gurion's retirement. In fact, on the eve of the Six-Day War in 1967, Begin traveled to Ben-Gurion's kibbutz in the desert and proposed that Ben-Gurion become prime minister again for the sake of national morale. While Ben-Gurion declined, he appreciated the suggestion, later saying, "If I knew Begin like I know him now, the face of history would have been different." In 1969, he wrote to Begin, "My wife Paula has become an admirer of yours, for some reason. I was strongly opposed to several of your viewpoints and actions, and I don't regret that because in my opinion I was right. Anyone is capable of making a mistake without realizing it. But on a personal level, I have never had anything against you, and the more I have gotten to know you in recent years, the more I have appreciated you, and my Paula is pleased about that." Now, whether this was a heartfelt olive branch or the ramblings of a man who some historians believe was in the early stages of dementia remains unknown. But after receiving the letter, Begin wondered aloud if they would have been spared many tragic situations had he and Ben-Gurion been better acquainted with each other earlier on. As we mentioned earlier, Begin continued to clash with the ruling Labor Party under the leadership of Prime Ministers Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin. In 1973, he railed against Golda Meir in the Knesset after she entertained a land for peace plan that was heavy on the land but with no formal commitment to peace. But later in the Knesset cafeteria, he sauntered up to Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, who was then the ambassador to the US, and after a lengthy debate, he told them, "To me, you were always the first among equals. But now that I have returned to the opposition, I shall have to oppose you whenever I believe you are in error. But on a personal level, my respect for you shall never waver." Later in 1976, when Prime Minister Rabin sent commandos to save Jewish hostages in Entebbe rather than negotiate with the terrorists, Begin said to Rabin, "Mr. Prime Minister, I salute you for all that you have done. Well, while all your colleagues have a share in the decision-making responsibility, upon your shoulders rests an extra morsel of responsibility. And who can measure the weight of that extra morsel? This to the very soldier who had opened fire on him on the Tel Aviv beach almost 30 years earlier. So this is the story of Israel's first prime ministers. They disagreed with each other in every conceivable way. Their methods of battle were not always the most congenial. They name-called, they fought a lot, they even shot at each other. But through their fiery debates, they had a mutual respect. That's an odd thought. Respecting someone with whom you disagree? Maybe we should try that one more often. Drop your comments and questions below, and don't forget to subscribe.